and welcome to the premiere episode of October Surprise, a podcast created for citizens by citizens in Pennsylvania's new 16th Congressional District. I'm Jim Roddy, a lifelong resident of Northwest Pennsylvania, and your host for today's podcast. A little bit of background on our podcast first. October Surprise features a series of interviews designed to educate listeners in Erie, Crawford, Mercer, Lawrence, and Butler Counties on key issues that face both our district and our two congressional candidates, incumbent Mike Kelly and challenger Ron DiNicola. On each podcast, we'll also discuss ethical leadership, which unfortunately is in rare supply in Washington, D.C. in 2018. We'll do a lot of talking today and throughout the month of October on this podcast, but our ultimate goal is action. For democracy to work, you have to participate. We cannot be bystanders. So at a minimum, that means being an informed voter. You can help by sharing episodes of October Surprise with your family and at least one or two friends, the on-the-fence voters who live in our district. The ultimate action is to vote on Election Day. Let's surprise the special interest groups, the political action committees, and the big money when we take back our district on Tuesday, November 6th, and once again, put people first. Finally, I'm not a political veteran or a campaign strategist. I don't have all the answers, and I guess, quite frankly, neither do they. But together, we're going to learn what's happening in our district by talking with elected officials, grassroots leaders, and extraordinary citizens from PA 16 in each episode. Our special guest today is Chris Rieger. His name might sound familiar because he ran for the Democratic nomination for Congress earlier this year. Chris is a lifelong Pennsylvanian, born in Altoona, who now resides in Butler County. He's a full-time private practice attorney and an active volunteer for the Money in Your Pocket Coalition, a program that provides free tax assistance to elderly and low-income working families in western Pennsylvania. Chris, thanks for your time today, and welcome to October Surprise.
Thanks very much, Jim. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, glad we could connect. So I know a lot of folks want to dive into the issues, but before we do that, let's talk about leadership. And sure. It's kind of making me nuts that ethical leadership and moral leadership really seems to be ignored today when I think they should be the foundation for elected officials. It seems today like there's less courage among our elected leaders to speak up when something's clearly wrong or untrue, and oftentimes we, the people, don't hold them accountable and penalize them for saying something that's obviously untrue. I want to get your perspective. Are you seeing a crisis today in ethical leadership, in high-character leadership among our elected officials?
Well, I would say, quite unfortunately, that's the case. Now, that's something that I don't really think has started with, for instance, the current administration that's occupying the Oval Office right now. It's something that has gone on for quite some time. I do think it's reflective of how polarized we are as a nation, and I think the problem is that many individuals who run for public office, and this is me still being my young idealistic self, I think the overwhelming majority of individuals who run for public office do so when they first start out. They do it with the utmost best intentions. But the problem is, the few that are fortunate enough to win election, I think what happens now is they stay in campaign mode. They basically try to govern the way that they campaign, which anymore is you don't appeal to a chunk of voters who may or may not be with you on any given issue, but you have to persuade. It's basically just getting out your base. And that is a reflection of, number one, I think our gerrymandered districts, because oftentimes the general elections don't matter in a lot of these gerrymandered districts. So, people in western and northwestern Pennsylvania know that very well. And then I think it's also a symptom of basically individuals gravitating to reinforced narratives. People get repelled by what they don't agree with. So I think what happens is individuals they isolate themselves in these silos, basically, these sound chambers that reinforce their opinions that they already have, and I think that trickles the whole way up to people in office. So as I said, it didn't start with, the era of Trump or anything. I think it would be unfair to, lay 100% of the blame at Republicans in office today and Donald Trump, but I think it's kind of exacerbated now with the rhetoric we're seeing, and I think that's what's a big cause of this now.
Yeah, good point. And, historically, I'm not naive. We're not naive that politicians have told lies for a long time, but oftentimes it was you do something, you think about Gary Hart when he had to, pull himself out of the Democratic nomination, back in the 80s for what he did, and then you think nowadays people are like, oh, well, what are you going to do? Move on from that. So it seems like there's less shame. It also seems like it's brazen, like you mentioned about the gerrymandering. I'm in Erie, Pennsylvania. Who could have thought it was a logical, rational thing to just cut Erie in half when you gerrymander the district? It's clearly unfair, but people thought, well, I'm just going to be able to get away with it. And so, the gerrymandering is just an example of that. I'm glad to see the district change, though. I'm sure you are as well.
Oh, absolutely. When I was still running during the primary, I think it was a Monday afternoon, I was actually in town on my way to a hearing, and I got the news that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had struck down the prior map. And I remember texting my wife/campaign manager how excited we were that we were going to be getting new maps. Now, at the time, we didn't know what those maps were going to look like, but I did know, I think a few days later, that they had retained, I believe his name's Nathaniel Cohen, but I'm not entirely sure, who was going to redraw the maps. And he is someone, the Stanford professor, he was someone who was lauded by both Republicans and Democrats for his work in other states. And then, of course, when the maps finally came out, not just the 16th district, but the maps across the entire Commonwealth, the districts, for the most part, were very much more representative of the regions that they encompassed. Our old third district, for instance, as you just said, Erie County was chopped in half, thereby diluting the Erie County vote, which basically rendered the vote up in northwestern Pennsylvania useless. And so you had communities like Albion in the same congressional district as, just south of Clarion, which made little to no sense. But now the I-79 corridor is basically reunified, and I think that's critical. But we were seeing that across the state. The old Keith Rothfuss's old district, PA-12, looked like, I think the running joke was, it looked like a salamander holding a hammer or something. It was mostly Beaver County, but then it wiggled through the northern Pittsburgh suburbs and the whole way over to Johnstown, almost where I was from. And it just didn't make a whole lot of sense how a lot of these districts were constructed, except for the fact that you wanted to create these super safe districts, and that's how you got the old 13 Republican to 5 Democrat breakdown statewide.
Right, despite the Democrats getting 83,000 more votes statewide. It seems like what people want is to be fair, and that's all that they're looking for is fairness. They also want, I think, a quality leadership. They want leaders to speak up when appropriate. And I guess tying into our day and age in 2018 in our district, we've seen the president act like a bully and a bigot. A few months ago, he supported a credibly accused child molester for Senate, in Alabama. He creates and spreads misinformation, blatant stuff several times a week, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Yet Mike Kelly, who's the incumbent, never says anything about that. He's consistently just a cheerleader for the administration and never holding them accountable. Do you think he has a responsibility to speak up when this happens? Again, at least occasionally. I mean, I understand. I'm not naive. I understand they're part of the same party, but doesn't he have to speak up when these things happen?
Well, of course, I think, and it's not just Mr. Kelly, I think it's anyone in office, but I think, again, this is reflective of this hyper-partisanship we're seeing, and I think it's hyper-tribalism as well, the tendency to, just to kind of stick with your side of the team no matter what is said or done. But it's critical for individuals like Mike Kelly, who've been in office for a while, to speak up on a lot of these issues, because I think what the problem is a lot of our democratic norms are under attack, oftentimes quite literally, from the current administration. And the fact that Donald Trump campaigned the way he did, I think the problem is that Americans or have been kind of desensitized, for lack of a better word. We've become kind of used to this sort of behavior, and I think Americans have to remember that this sort of thing is not normal. The criticism of our independent judiciary, the refusal to stand up to somebody like Vladimir Putin when the whole world is watching, when he himself said that he wanted Trump to win the election, and every single one of our intelligence agencies indicated that Russia did, in fact, meddle in our elections. It is critical, especially when you have unified government where Republicans control every branch down in Washington. You do need individuals with leadership that are able to speak up about this. And the reason why that's important is, and why I don't understand why individuals like Mike Kelly won't stand up more for our democracy, is that Donald Trump's days are numbered. He's not going to be in the Oval Office forever, and the overwhelming majority of these lawmakers in Washington are going to be there presumably long after he's gone. So I'm not entirely sure what they have to gain, but again, I suppose this goes back to individuals sticking in campaign mode, because recent polls indicate that Donald Trump is still more popular in our district in PA 16 than even Mike Kelly is. So Mike Kelly, politically, in an election year, probably only has something to lose if he came out and criticized the president. So it's quite unfortunate because if you have a Congress that is not going to act as a check on the executive, if you have a Congress that's going to be complacent in all of this, then what do we have left? We just have a judiciary, but now the courts are getting packed with like-minded folks as well, and that's going to cause a huge problem.
Right, and like you said, putting the team first ahead of principles is a problem. We see that in sports, where there's an athlete who commits a serious transgression, and if it's a team that you're rooting for, oftentimes the fans will excuse his behavior. I remember Barry Bonds, when he was playing for San Francisco, clearly there were steroids involved with what he was doing. Every other park he went to, he got booed. At San Francisco, they'd give him a standing ovation, and that's essentially, people now, they hear a comment and they say first, wait, is that person a Republican or Democrat? Like, just make up your mind based on the principle rather than the team that you're on. Speaking of the team, I want to talk about your team, and about your own leadership. So right after Ron DiNicola won the Democratic primary in the spring of this year, even though you were his opponent in the primary, you immediately and very enthusiastically supported him in his campaign. It just really struck me from a distance, how much humility that showed to quickly do that. Can you talk about the importance of humility to be an effective leader, and I guess, your own journey to be able to do that and support him?
Well, sure. Right after the primary was over, there was no question that I was going to support Ron, but I think largely for two reasons. Number one was Ron himself. He made a point, and when I was running during the primary, I made it a point over and over again that it was going to take a cohesive 5-county effort to defeat Mike Kelly this November. And I meant that, and I still do. And what struck me is that Ron, about a week after the primary, he reached out to me. He came down to Mercer County, and he met with a number of local grassroots organizers, local labor leaders, local elected officials, local activists in Butler, Mercer, and Lawrence counties. And I really applauded him for that because I would say nearly everyone in the room, we met at a restaurant in Grove City, nearly everyone in the room supported me for the primary. But nonetheless, he came down, he met with everyone, reaffirmed his commitment to the region. So that struck me. So that was one reason why I got behind Ron and why I'm still behind him and why, I'm doing the best I can to coordinate, for instance, canvassing efforts down here in Butler and Lawrence and Mercer counties in the southern end of the district. But also, if it was Ron or if it was somebody else, and this goes back to the humility thing, you do have to be humble to do this because we're all on this, and I hate to reflect the whole tribal aspect, but we all are on the same team, and the cause is the same, and that is to take back our democracy, take back, and more specifically, the House and perhaps both houses of Congress this year. And I didn't want to fall in the same trap that our side, Democrats, fell into in 2016. Because there has been this tendency with many factions within the party, just oftentimes we fail to rally around a nominee because a nominee does not perfectly and rigidly fit into our own ideological puzzle. And the only, I heard John Fetterman speak at a seminar shortly after I announced last year, and he said the only perfect candidate in your own mind is going to be you.
Right. Right.
So at some point, you have to put those, that skepticism aside and just rally behind someone who you feel, for the most part, shares your values. And certainly Ron DiNicola fits that mold. And and this goes back to humility. This whole campaign, my campaign, and a lot of campaigns similar to mine nationwide, are bigger than any one candidate. Certainly bigger than me. And if I wasn't humble in all this, if I didn't, say that, hey, we have a common goal that we all have to strive towards, then we were just going to fall in the same trap of 2016, and we weren't going to get anywhere, and we weren't going to flip Congress, and we were just going to be stuck in this rut that we find ourselves in now. So I think that was largely those two reasons. Ron himself obviously had a lot to do with it. I think he's a great candidate and a great person, but just the times demand humility. The times demand unity, and I think that's why humility is so important.
Right, and like you said, the tribal thing, people like drawing lines even inside of one community. Like I went to Gannon University, and always kind of struck me how fraternities and sororities would draw all these lines, and you're thinking, let's be honest, we're all, essentially middle class, upper middle class kids from Western Pennsylvania. Why are we dividing off like we're so different? And people tend to do that, so you've got to have humility to look what the other person's doing. And Chris, you brought up about the values and the principles and the issues. Let's talk about the issues of this campaign. And I want to start off just in more general, because you're in Butler, I'm in Erie. It's about 100 miles away, but it can seem at times worlds apart about what's going on. What are you seeing in Butler and the surrounding area? What are the biggest challenges that are also important to this campaign?
Well, Butler in particular, I think it has a little bit more in common with Erie than many people think, but Butler is kind of a tale of two counties, if you just look within our borders. We're way down in the southwest corner of Butler County in Cranberry Township, and it's one of the fastest growing areas in the entire Commonwealth. It's seeing an enormous amount of growth, and over the last 10 years, it's gone from very, very rural farmland, agrarian, to massive suburbia almost overnight. Many of and I think that's reflective of the changing demographics that we're seeing nationwide. A lot of these suburbs that are filled with many more younger professionals, people my age, doctors, lawyers, college professors, and they're reflecting this demographic shift. So there's an enormous amount of economic growth right down in our region of the county. But the problem is, and I think this is reflective of the district and many communities across the country, is that what I want to see is I want to see this kind of economic opportunity, and I want to see this kind of economic investment from many companies in other areas, not just areas like ours. Mm-hmm. So, you hear oftentimes that Butler County, the population of Butler County keeps increasing, which is true, but where is the population increasing? People are moving down around us in Cranberry. They're moving to Seven Fields, Adams, Mars, and Middlesex Township. They're not necessarily moving to the city of Butler or Zelienople or Portersville or even Slippery Rock University, in and around Slippery Rock University. So I want to see that kind of economic investment elsewhere in the surrounding communities, not just tucked away in these little pockets of massive metro areas. I think the economic power in America is concentrated in urban areas, but I'd like to see more investment elsewhere in infrastructure and renewable energy, and that these sorts of emerging industries to give people in areas like the I-79 corridor a fair shake. When candidate Trump was campaigning in 2016, he was making this point about how there are pockets of America that have largely become ignored and kind of left out of these new emerging economies, and he wasn't entirely wrong about that. Now, I don't believe he's remotely sincere about doing anything about it, but that point, that reality, is still a reality, and I want to see positive change affect us all, not just in tiny little corners of America.
And it's such a great point to bring up, and as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm not a political veteran or a campaign strategist, and so how does that happen? What can happen to get that economic opportunity to build that infrastructure? Like, how does that tie into our election?
Well, it ties in because I think I think local communities, local legislators, county commissioners, and the like need a partner in Washington that can acknowledge that reality and that can bring the necessary funding and commitment from Washington to make it happen. And I don't think areas like the 16th District have that. I think you need someone who's receptive, someone who reflects the district and their needs. I don't think Mike Kelly reflects it. I think he's talked at length about infrastructure in areas like Erie and up and down the I-79 corridor, but he hasn't really delivered. And I haven't heard a peep from him over the years about investing in things like renewable energy. When I was campaigning during the primary, I said over and over again that there are jobs to be had in areas like ours and things like solar and wind. You notice you don't see a whole lot of wind turbines down on Grand Street in downtown Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot of vast untapped areas and untapped resources in areas like ours where that can happen. But you need a partner in Washington that's going to advocate for that. And I don't think the 16th District has it now.
Got it. Thank you for tying that in. I appreciate that. There's also, you're talking about economic opportunity and the growth. If we can talk about poverty as well, so folks who are on the lower end. So I found this quote when I was researching before we got together, a quote from your campaign, and I'm hoping you can expand upon it. You said, if you're working full-time, you should not be in poverty. So why do you believe that? And a lot of people don't, quite frankly. There's a lot of folks who are fighting the minimum wage in general as a principle and raising the minimum wage. So why do you believe that if you're working full-time, you shouldn't be in poverty?
Well, I think it's largely reflective of the kind of work I've been doing outside of my law practice, and also the kind of work that I do because I'm a consumer protection advocate. But as you mentioned earlier, I work with an organization called Just Harvest, which runs a program called the Money in Your Pocket Coalition, which works in conjunction with the United Way of southwestern Pennsylvania. And how the program works is volunteers like myself are certified by the Internal Revenue Service to provide free tax prep. Millions of working Americans, they'll waste several $100s a year at places like H&R Block to get their taxes done when they otherwise would qualify for free tax prep at programs like ours. And oftentimes they're trying to apply for things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the largest anti-poverty program in America. Okay, it's not welfare, it's the Earned Income Tax Credit. And things like that, and the Child Tax Credit, the American Opportunity Credit, which deals with expenses for post-secondary education, for instance. All of these tax credits have one thing in common. They're earned credits, meaning you have to work to earn them. And, the people that are getting their taxes done that apply for these programs that are getting, say, $5,000 or $6,000 back, these aren't individuals who are looking for a handout. These are individuals who are working 2, sometimes 3 jobs at minimum wage. maybe a couple of kids in the house, and they might be getting $5,000 or $6,000 back in federal tax credits, but it's to supplement a $25,000 a year salary to feed a family of 3 or 4, which is completely inadequate. So to circle back to your question, I believe that because I think it's largely a moral imperative. If you're working full-time and you still can't support yourself or support your family, well, then in my judgment, that goes against who we are, as who we should be as a society. I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can say that people shouldn't be entitled to a minimum wage, but then when people are working, they still have to apply for welfare, which I'm seeing all the time. So I think if you provide a living wage for individuals, I think I think everyone benefits. You would satisfy this moral obligation that people are able to provide for themselves and provide for their families without being a burden, to other taxpayers.
Right, and just from a family standpoint, and thanks for breaking that down, I think what happens is, so folks like you and me were college educated. We haven't even thought really about minimum wage in our own lives since maybe high school, and then you start saying, well, I don't understand how that makes such a big impact from a family standpoint, but if we want to do additional activities, we're able to go do it. But if you're working at $9 an hour and you're working 2,080 hours in a year, so that would be 40 hours a week for 52 weeks. That is no vacations whatsoever. That's 40 hours every week. $9 an hour, you're grossing $18,700. And so I'm guessing folks who are listening to this podcast right now, you couldn't do anywhere close to what you do right now at 18.7 from a gross standpoint. So what you end up doing is, like you said, picking up another job. And so even if you do work then 60 hours a week every single week, that's going to get you to $27,000 as a gross. And if you have kids working 60 hours a week every week, you just aren't able to spend time with them and develop them and build up from a healthy standpoint. So is that kind of what you're saying from a moral standpoint where, boy, if we have a higher wage, those folks not only would be able to put more money back into our economy, they'd be able to spend time with their family, which is what's life all about, to be honest with you.
Oh, that's precisely right. And, I think that kind of dispels this myth about how, well, minimum wage jobs, they're only for high school students anyway, so we shouldn't have to worry about that. Well, first of all, that's not true because I work with these people, every tax season and in my own private practice. The people that are working to qualify for these various credits, they're not high school students. They're parents. Many of them are out of school. Most of them are out of school. Some are even elderly, and they don't want to retire because they're worried about sustaining themselves. So. You make an outstanding point. Even if you bump it up to say $13 an hour, you're still grossing under $30,000 a year. I mean, the state median income for a household of one in the state of Pennsylvania is around $54,000 a year. Now, should minimum wage be $54,000 a year? Probably not, but there should be some wage establishment where someone can maintain a minimal and respectable standard of living. That is who I think we should be as a nation. I think we owe it to the American worker to do so.
Right, and just to add on to that, I've heard folks say, well, go get training, go learn a trade. So I guess a few points on that. One is, that'd be great if you could, but how do you pay for it? And if you're only, again, grossing, $20,000 a year, how do you pay for it? And if you're working all the time, how do you find time to do that? And then, if I hear people say, go become a plumber. Well, we only need so many plumbers, and if there's 60 million, minimum wage workers in the United States, you don't have room, the economy doesn't have room for that many plumbers or that whatever. We're always going to have folks working in the restaurant industry in some of these lower skill minimum wage jobs, and what are we going to do about it? There seems to be a reality that we have to face. And so I guess what would you think? What would be a solution to that? What would help take some steps in the right direction that you would like, our next congressman to do?
Well, I think there needs to be an advocate for instance, I advocated, for instance, for the Raise the Wage Act, which establishes a form of a living wage, which basically, over time, ties it to increased costs, basically inflation. For instance, I do bankruptcy law, and I think how you can do it is there are various standards set by the Internal Revenue Service. Bankruptcy is often means tested. Your income determines your ability to pay your debts, and there are standards set by the IRS that increase periodically with inflation. So I think you can do it that way, number one. But I think that's also reflective of income inequality that we're seeing nationwide, and how organized labor, for instance, has their clout and their power over the last 35 to 40 years has really taken a massive hit in various ways. And we see a correlation between that and increasing income inequality, lack of upward social mobility, and relatively stagnant wages. And what you get is an entirely generation now, namely millennials, who are burdened with stagnant wage growth, the inability, for instance, to purchase a house, and massive amounts of student loan debt, which cut into consumer power. So I think a new Congress has to deal with a number of different issues. Subsidizing higher education is part of it. Getting people involved in the trades, because again, there are jobs to be had in a lot of these new industries, and you need tradesmen to do it. College is great, but it's not for everyone.
Right.
And I think there needs to be an investment in a lot of these new apprenticeship programs to find spots for people. So I think that's what you do. You invest in the American worker, and I don't think this Congress is doing that.
And Chris, I know you've got to run. Again, we're talking about work. You and I both have to get back to our day jobs that actually pay the bills. But one more subject I wanted to bring up to you, because this is kind of about the 1-2 punch with wages and then health care. And so a lot of people are in financial distress because of healthcare bills. Personally, I'm a 16-year cancer survivor, and I am so grateful that I had health care back then, that I was able to go get the care that I needed and get it paid for the most part. What's your take on everyone being able to afford to be able to take care of themselves, especially in emergency situations? Do you put this in the same moral bucket that you do of being able to spend time with your family and have a living wage?
Well, precisely. Well, I put it in two categories. One's a moral imperative. The other is an economic imperative. The issue of healthcare is big with me, as you might know, because, again, I do bankruptcy law, and the overwhelming majority of bankruptcies filed in the United States are filed because of unpaid medical bills. And we are the only nation in the world where that is a reality. Great Britain, Canada, nations of Western Europe, the amount of bankruptcies filed because of medical bills total zero. In the United States, they total over 600,000. So there is a moral imperative, because I do believe that access to adequate health care is a fundamental human right. But there's an economic incentive as well, because I think we hear a talking point where, well, we already spend more for health care than every other nation in the world. And yes, that is correct. And precisely the reason we do is because we have a system that is designed to not cover everyone. Where you have these high-risk pools and where people are not covered, then that is going to necessarily raise costs for everyone else, because the private insurance companies still have a stake in the game. And when you have administrative bloat pushing 20% in the private insurance industry, then you see where all those extra dollars come from. I in the primary, as many people know, I advocated the switch to single payer, again, because of the moral imperative, but economically it makes sense, because you're saving at least $600 billion a year, under a Medicare for All system. As I said, the administrative bloat in the private insurance industry is around 20%. Medicare, it's about 3%, for advertising costs and that sort of thing. So I think so many financial decisions nationwide are made with healthcare as the number one concern.
Right.
And so again, there's the moral imperative, but economically, there would be so much more individual choice and individual freedom if that was no longer a concern for millions of working Americans.
Yeah, and I can say the last thing on healthcare is I still haven't met a person who doesn't deserve healthcare, and no one suggested to me, this person, they shouldn't get healthcare. Like, we're all humans. I'm a human. You're a human. No matter what, I mean, folks deserve to get healthcare. It shouldn't be just limited to a certain group of people, and other people have to suffer and eventually die because of a lack of healthcare.
Oh, absolutely, and I think it's incumbent upon us to communicate that point better. I think it's not necessarily, while it's a handout, it's an entitlement. No, it's a basic right, and I think people need to also be made aware that everyone benefits if everyone is covered in the short term and the long term.
Exactly. Well, very good. Well, Chris Rieger, thank you very much for your time today and for stepping up. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. I greatly appreciate the opportunity and the invitation, and just to reiterate that, I think you mentioned earlier that, I said this extensively throughout the primary, and I'll keep saying it, democracy is not just voting, democracy is participation. So take your enthusiasm you have this year that you're going to have in the voting booth, but take it a step further right now. Knock on doors, make phone calls, and get active, because it's all about participation, and without participating, our democracy just doesn't work. So I thank you for doing this, and I encourage everyone to be active between now and November.
Great, and to add on to what Chris just said, our podcast is over today, but there's still much more work that we need to do. As we talked about at the start, we can't be bystanders. You have to participate, and you can help by sharing this episode with your family and at least one or two on-the-fence voters who live in our district, and then by voting on Election Day. Let's surprise those special interest groups, the political action committees, and the big money when we take back our district on Tuesday, November 6th, and once again, put people first. I'm Jim Roddy. Thanks so much for listening to October Surprise.